My presentation today is giving some feedback on the bulletin that we put out late last year and the follow-up assessments that we carried out. So the first half of the presentation covers that, and the second half covers giving you an update on what's going on with lifting in New South Wales and Australia. So if you recall, last year, the regulator gave a presentation. So the Chief Inspector, Anthony Margetts, gave a presentation to industry around the 14th of December. The presentation was covered really our concerns in regard to a spate of falling object incidents that occurred basically in the previous 12 to 18 months. It's coming slowly, I can see it. The presentation targeted general managers, and stat engineers. It was done through, I think, a Microsoft Teams process. And I'm not sure what the numbers were, but we had excellent attendance at that presentation. And the presentation really was covered our concerns. Is that it? Yeah, we're there. Okay. All right. I'll segue into the presentation. So as I said earlier, the presentation covers lifting, the lifting and cranage online intervention feedback. So I'm giving you feedback on that, and also an industry update. As I said, it was delivered on the 14th of December. And unlike what we've normally done in the past, where it's taken us some time to make the presentation available, it was available to industry within about 2 days. So we sped up that process. And then we followed it up the first half of this year with a number of assessments. And in fact, we've carried out about 22 assessments up to June. So this is a couple of the slides. So I've included a couple of the slides just to prompt your memory. So this first slide was really explaining why we were doing what we were doing. So we're conducting this online intervention as a trial. So in the past, what we've done is we've identified an issue in the industry, and typically we've developed an assessment tool and gone straight out into the field to see what was actually going on at mines, issued notices and so on. There was a conscious decision made to change our approach just to see how it would work. And that's why the Chief Inspector gave the presentation, and then there was an expectation on industry to act based on the recommendations in that presentation, and then we followed that up by going out and doing assessments. So there was a concerning trend in the lifting incidents, and we'd seen an increase in incidents relating to haul truck maintenance, and you'll see a couple of those coming up. So if you recall, the first one was where a team of fitters were in the process of separating the taper between the wheel hub and the strut. And no matter how many times you see it, you're still amazed that no one got hurt. The second one was this gentleman here was taking the wheel strut off that base plate on that jig on the front of that forklift. He's working on his own at the time. And you can see he loses control of the load and is almost pinched between the strut and the forklift structure. So he's very fortunate. Then we had this incident here where this team of fitters were in the process of breaking the taper. Here they were using a telehandler, and you can see that the stabilisers on the front of the telehandler aren't in place. They're in the process of breaking that taper. There's a couple of fitters very close to being underneath that load. When it separates, Obviously, the tyres take the load, they deflate significantly and the load's dropped. No one's injured, but again, very, very close. This one here, if you look at the right-hand side, same job, but this time using a forklift. And you can see what happens in this case, solid tyres on the front of the forklift, the rear end of the forklift raises, the load drops. And again, there was at least 2 fitters in the line of fire there, but really all we got out of that one was one of the fitters had a bruised arm. So again, very, very fortunate. And then of course we had this one where they were putting the engine module in. They were having some trouble getting it to actually slide in on the rails. You can see the gentleman there behind the radiator. He's been in there for some time. It suddenly moves. He's obviously in the line of fire and is very fortunate not to be squashed between the radiator and the structure. Following that, this occurred on the 4th of December. This hoist cylinder was up in place. It was pinned at the bottom. It was up at about 20 degrees, held in place by a ratchet strap. Fitter was standing on that platform there, disconnected the ratchet strap. Of course, the cylinder fell forward, knocked him onto the axle box, squashed his leg, broke his leg. So those incidents all occurred before the presentation, and they were effectively what triggered the presentation being given. Following the presentation, and just about around the time when we'd started going out into the field doing the assessments, we had this incident occur at a quarry where a Franna crane rolled over on its side. Same 24-hour period, we had a telehandler roll on its side. The operator there was scrapping some AFC chain. And then a month later, we had this incident at a quarry where they were trying to pull that driver's cabin back up into the upright position using a forklift and what appeared to be a homemade lifting jig, and the assembly fell off the front of the forklift, and there was a person adjacent to it, and it fell on top of him. So we've had this spate of significant incidents, and what we saw, done this little graph here you would have seen, that shows the number of incidents were increasing and the time between the incidents was shortening, and also the significant injuries associated with those incidents were increasing as well. So all this was coming together, and we've taken this new approach with this issue. So there's a lot of recommendations and slides that I'm not showing now, but there was these recommendations made to the senior leadership. If you remember, the senior leadership members were involved in this presentation. So there were some recommendations made for the senior leadership on this slide. So, the three mechanical inspectors in Cole, myself, Bill Costello and Mick Howes, we did about 22, I think, assessments. And last week, the consolidated report came out showing what our findings were. Now, I've only got one slide covering it, so if you want to see more details, you can go to our website and have a look at the consolidated report. In the assessment, there was about, I think, 9 questions that we went out and asked at each of the mines we attended. In general, we wanted to know if you'd shown the bulletin to people, who you'd shown it to, if any and all of the recommendations that we'd made had been addressed by the mines. Okay, and if you can, I don't know how hard it is to see, but you can see there was a 94% compliance. So what we saw in terms of the mines' response was excellent. Okay, a bit more detail of the 22 assessments. There was a total of 198 individual findings assessed, 13 assessment findings with enforcement action, 9 compliance notices. So overall, it was a very, very good result, we believe. But just to give you a little bit of background or a bit of context for the sort of things that we saw when we were out in the field, pretty much all the mines had run a risk assessment, either specifically in regard to doing wheel strut and wheel hub assembly replacements. And in general, pretty much every mine went from, if they were breaking the taper on the machine, they went to a full assembly change and then broke it on the floor. The design and manufacture of jigs to allow safe separation of the taper. There's been an industry response where a number of engineering firms are designing jigs to allow tapers to be broken on the machine. We've also seen differing approaches from mines. Some have dealt with the recommendations singularly as the mine itself, while some of the big miners, and certainly one of the bigger miners, took a corporate approach, involved all of their mines, all of their engineers, and also some of the OEMs, which was quite good as well. At least one of the mines implemented a STIP process, which is effectively a process where the team is expected to identify what would be the high-risk step in a process. And in the case of doing lifting, the lifting step is identified, and then there's an expectation that they'll call the supervisor in, who will then assess the setup for the job before they go ahead and do the lift. So that was quite interesting to see. Some mines have started training their supervisors up in a specific lift supervisor training course that's delivered by the Crane Industry Council of Australia. And all mines have shown the bulletin, pretty much. There's a couple of blind spots for some mines where they didn't roll it out at coal prep, and it clearly applies to coal prep, because if you think about the issues that the fellas changing or breaking the taper had, they were in quite a confined space, and that's typically the kind of issue you face in a coal prep plant, where you're working in and around screens, centrifuges, that sort of thing, when you're doing the lifting. So mines have been hoping to remind you that if you did miss out on your coal prep plants, take the presentation to them. Some contractors were missed. I spoke to a lot of crane drivers, from companies like Boom and Borgia and that kind of thing, that kind of company, and some of them hadn't seen the presentation. That was more about the fact that they weren't at the same mine all the time, but they still had been missed. And what's my last point there? Oh, and one of the other positives we saw was some of the mines were running the presentation on a loop in lunchrooms and in common areas, which was a positive as well. So some mines also had looked at the high-risk work licences that their people had and related the content of that training against the work that was happening on site, and had developed training courses to fill the gap, which was a positive as well. Typically, all the workers that we talked to who were involved in lifting had their high-risk work licences, but the question then is, does a high-risk work licence on its own make people competent? And I'd question that it does. But in general, what we saw from talking to leadership team members and from workers, there seems to be a lack of understanding of what's the content of those high-risk work licences around dogging and rigging. And some of the feedback we got from the older crane drivers and riggers was, in the old days when they got their ticket, they had to go to TAFE for 6 months or 12 months. Then they had to have a logbook, which had to be signed off after they did every lift. Then that had to be submitted before they could get their high-risk work licence. Now, that doesn't happen anymore, but you'll see at the end of this presentation that might be coming back. Okay, so just in terms of qualified versus competent, and in relation to what we saw during the assessment, what we saw was that in regards to the incidents specific to this presentation, typically the paperwork was done prior to the lift, and in general, the correct paperwork was used. But what we did see was, in a lot of cases, the JHAs were fairly poorly filled out and they lacked detail. The appropriate high-risk work licences were in place. They were using fit-for-purpose equipment, which was in date, suitably rated. The workers spoken to were confident the load wouldn't drop as a consequence of the equipment failing. So they were all very confident they weren't going to get injured by a falling object. But what we believe they had done was the issue of risk management at the point where the components are separated from the fixture on the mobile plant wasn't properly understood and controlled. And we saw that time and time again in those film footage, where at the point where the components separated, whether it was coming off the jig or the taper was being broken, they lost control of the load, and they hadn't really appreciated the issues associated with that. So I took the opportunity during this process to have a look and see what was available to industry when it comes to training. And I looked specifically at the Dogman's ticket. And it was quite interesting going online and seeing what training for a dogman I could get throughout New South Wales. And even though it's a national unit of competency where there should be a consistent approach by all the training companies, I can still pay somewhere between $1,200 and $1,400 and do a 3-day course, or do a 4-day course, or do a 5-day course to get the same ticket. So as engineers, it's important, if you're sending your people to get their high-risk work licence, you know who's doing it for you and what's the content that's being covered in that training. Of course, there's other supplementary training that's available. There's the Conduct Underground Lifting Operations training. There's the new Slinging, Lifting and Towing training package that was developed as part of an enforceable undertaking last year. And there's also RTO developed training that can be developed for you. And typically, if that's being done, it's based on the gap analysis you've done in regards to the work you're doing on site and the high-risk work licence content. Ultimately, though, if you want your people to be competent, you've got to give them the opportunity to use that qualification. And in talking to a lot of workers, they really weren't getting that opportunity. Spoke to a couple of fellas who'd recently, 3 years prior to the conversation, had been sent to get their Franna ticket or non-slew crane ticket, and they'd had it for 3 years and never driven the Franna. So you can imagine what happens. There's a breakdown on site. You've got a ticket, go and drive the Franna. They're effectively going to have to retrain themselves before they can actually drive the machine. So they need to get the opportunity. So, with competency in mind and trying to segue a little into this, the second half of this presentation, what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what's happening in New South Wales and in Australia generally in the lifting space. So in June this year, New South Wales published the Dogging and Rigging Guide, and WorkSafe Australia in June published this discussion paper, and I'm going to talk about both of these documents in some detail now. So in regards to the Dogging and Rigging Guide, it's a practical guide for dogging and rigging. It combines the relevant industry-specific information on dogging and rigging and serves the purpose of providing industry with one contemporary practical guide. And it's been put together with this group of organisations. It's available online. It's about 80 pages, and it's a great reference document. So it's structured to reflect the nationally uniform certificate classes for dogging and rigging, which may be changing in 12 to 18 months' time. It's consistent with Australian standards and covers equipment and work involved with rigging, and it's relevant for pretty much everybody here in the room and workers in general. So that's available to you online. But the thing I like about it is when you go to the Dogging and Rigging newsouthwales.gov website, you'll see that there's lots of resources available to you. You can see down the bottom there, that's Andrew Taylor from Bullivants. He's their National Training Manager. He's got a number of presentations in there on basic rigging. Okay, so it's quite a useful tool for your maintenance personnel. You can show them that. There's obviously the document itself, But the thing that I quite like is this calculator. It's a rigging calculator. And there's two calculators there. There's a sling calculator and there's a capacity calculator. So what it allows you to do is put in the relevant information. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see there's some relevant information you've got to put in there. The weight of the load, the type of slings that you're using, the arrangement of the slings, the angle of the slings, and then at the bottom tells you what the capacity is that you need or the type of sling that you need to use versus the capacity tool, which allows you to put in the relevant information in relation to the slings, and then it tells you, based on that arrangement, what the capacity is of that lifting arrangement. Now, I think it's a great tool, and it's something that maybe your supervisors could use. If you want your supervisors to engage with the guys who are doing the lifting, they could maybe reference this after or prior to the lift being carried out. Up to you, but certainly it's something that I think adds a bit more rigour to the process of lift design for simple lifts. Certainly not for complex lifts, but certainly for simple lifts. So that's what's available in New South Wales. Now, Safe Work Australia have been doing work in the lifting space since 2021. There were some recommendations made to Safe Work Australia in relation to rationalising and improving the process for high-risk work licences for crane drivers. And they put out a discussion paper in 2022. There were some recommendations made, and they've initiated some changes already. Specifically, it says there, removing the encompassment of non-slewing mobile cranes, vehicle loading cranes and reach stackers from the slewing crane licence. So what that's really saying is, as you probably know, if you've got a C6 slewing crane licence, you can drive a non-slew crane, you can drive a vehicle loading crane. What they're saying is they want to separate those and make them standalone qualifications. And the last one there is they're going to introduce a dogging licence prerequisite for most crane licences. So what they've identified there is there's a recognition now that you can have a crane driver's ticket but have never slung a load. And there's a level of concern that a crane driver can be sitting there and not have a clue what the dogman's doing. So now what they're saying is they believe that before you can get your crane driver's ticket, you'll have to have your dogman's ticket. Now, these are all recommendations and they haven't been implemented yet, but they're probably coming. Now, on the back of those findings in 2022, another discussion paper was put out, and it came out in June, and the discussion paper closed at the end of July. So as it says there, a set of detailed proposals, and they're looking at updating the licensing categories, revising the categories of crane licences to reflect modern equipment and practices, enhancing training requirements, implementing more comprehensive training modules to ensure operators are well versed in the latest safety protocols and crane technologies, streamlining the licensing process, simplifying the administrative aspects of obtaining and renewing high-risk work licences to make compliance easier for the operators and employers, and incorporating technological advances, ensuring the framework accommodates new technologies in crane operation, such as remote controls and automated system. So that's the context for what they put into the discussion paper. And this is the proposed licensing structure. So what you see there is there's three categories. There's the black category, which effectively they don't intend to make any changes to, and that's really the dogman's ticket. The white is they're looking at modifying the licences. And in terms of mining industry, the key areas there are obviously slew cranes, articulated crane, vehicle loading crane, and the telehandler licence. Okay. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So what does that really mean? What are they recommending? Because remember, this is all coming from a discussion paper, so they're recommendations and they're looking at feedback from industry. So They're looking at organising licences by function rather than lifting capacity, and I'll talk about each of these in some detail in a second. Practical experience for crane operators, introducing new licences for telehandlers, piling rigs and straddle cranes, structural changes to align training to specific skills and crane functions, including and incorporating some existing licences into other licence categories, a prerequisite training course for anyone operating a crane, and improving rigging licence framework to correct incongruities and reflect contemporary work practices. So what does that mean? So what they're recommending is that slewing cranes could be licensed according to function. So again, as you're probably aware, you can currently get a slew crane license, which is a C6, which allows you to drive a slewing crane up to 60-tonne capacity. They want to walk away from that. And if it's a slew crane, it'll either be a hydraulic or a lattice crane, say. You'll get a specific hydraulic crane driver's ticket, any capacity. Okay, so the whole issue of the mass of the load or the capacity of the crane will become irrelevant. It's all about the type of crane that you're driving. Okay. The rated capacity of vehicle loading cranes requiring a licence could be reduced from 10 metre tonnes to 1 tonne. So that's a pretty significant change in terms of the number of vehicle loading cranes that are being operated at all mines across New South Wales. Okay. There's very few 10 metre tonne cranes used on sites. They're all much smaller, so they'll all sit into this smaller category. So that's maybe coming as well. Non-slewing mobile cranes could require a licence regardless of the rated capacity. So this is, I think, trying to fix up the loophole you've got on telehandlers. So that has a non-slew crane function, and most of the telehandler suppliers supply you with a 2.9 tonne jib. And the rules around high-risk work licences are on a telehandler, if the lifting capacity of the crane function is less than 3 tonnes, you don't need a crane driver's ticket. So they're trying to close that loophole. And practical experience for crane operators. There's a lot of detail there, which you can read later. But really what that's saying is they're looking at going back to the old logbook or diary system where crane driver does the training, but then has to go out and get experience doing lifts, and then that's countersigned by a rigger or the employer. And then at the finish, it's like getting your driver's licence, your P plates or whatever. You've got to do that period and then submit the document before you can get your high-risk work licence. So it's adding some rigour in that process. Introducing a telehandler licence covering the operation of swing, slewing, non-slewing telehandlers with common attachments, including forks and so on. Optional elective licences could be introduced, covering the use of the telehandler with a work platform or a suspended load, so that's a lifting attachment. Split the existing crane licence unit of competency into smaller components and structure these with base and elective licences. So what they're looking at is, particularly for the rigging licences, going away from basic, intermediate, advanced, having a single rigger's qualification, but then depending on the industry you're working in and the specific, I suppose, high-risk kind of lifting that you're doing, you'll do a specific course around that particular hazard. Introduce a new prerequisite training course required for operating cranes over water. It's not really an issue for us. Removing the basic, intermediate, and I just talked about that. Adding elective licences to train the licence holder and allow them to undertake additional more complex rigging tasks, covered that. And continuing rigging activities that include similar skill sets. So trying to rationalise, I suppose, that initial rigging training course. So what I've tried to do there is give you an insight into what's been happening in New South Wales in the lifting space and also nationally. In terms of the WorkSafe Australia document that they've put out, it's now closed, and I wouldn't expect us to see much until sometime in 2025. At some point they'll make recommendations, and then as part of that model work health and safety laws that most of the states in states in Australia and territories other than Victoria are all signed up for. They'll make recommendations to the appropriate ministers of each of the states, and then they will or they won't take on those recommendations. So I suppose what I'm trying to do here is highlight there are changes coming, and some of them will have an impact on how you work and how you get your people trained. Again, you can go to the WorkSafe Australia website and have a look at what's available there. So, last slide. So just to finish off, sort of gone full circle now, I want to come back to just talk about really, as it says there, has the lifting and cranage online intervention been a success? Well, me personally, I think it has been a success, but there's a number of reasons why it has been a success. I think number one, the initial presentation by the Chief Inspector to mines leadership team members, so GMs, managers and stat engineers like yourself, showed that the regulator was taking the issue seriously, and we wanted to see a response from industry. The use of the film clips in the presentations seemed to be quite a powerful tool. In all the conversations we had at the mines, whether it was with supervisors who were delivering that presentation or workers, they all said it had a big impact on them. It all made them take a step back and have a think about work they were doing in that space, and how a lot of them thought, well, that could quite easily have happened to me as well. So those film clips have been very, very useful. Making the presentation available to industry very quickly. Okay, I think that making it available within 2 days kept its relevancy, and it meant that you could deliver it based on our recommendation immediately, rather than waiting 2 or 3 months, which was typically how we dealt with these presentations in the past. I don't know what's going on. Here we go. The other thing is, I think this is probably the key here, and that's been industry's response. Your response to that presentation has been excellent. There wasn't a mine that we went to that hadn't done a risk assessment, looked closely at the processes involved, and made significant changes. And that's been great. And the fact that suppliers are now working to come up with better methods and tools to allow you to break the tapers in relation to struts on the machines. And I also think the fact that we got out within a month or two of that bulletin being delivered kept some momentum up, because we were asking questions. What have you done? What are you going to do? And that kind of thing. So all in all, as a package, I think it's worked quite well, because the numbers actually stack up pretty well. But just to finish off, last 2 points, if I can get this thing to go. So what next? I think long term, you should be thinking about the whole competency issue when it comes to lifting. What qualifications have people got? What experience they got? What opportunities are you giving them to use those qualifications? But also, stay informed with these upcoming changes in regards to the high-risk work licences. And look, with that in mind, what we're going to try and do for our December get-togethers, the mechanical engineering get-togethers, is I'm trying to get a training company, RTO, to come and talk to us about, give us some details on what's covered in high-risk work licence training. And also I'm looking to get a representative from the CICA, who are sitting on that team that's working with Safe Work Australia, and hopefully that person will be able to give us some more context, because really all I've done is taken information from that discussion paper and put it into the slides. But I'd like to get more context for us and by the time we talk to them in December, he'll have a good idea of what's come out of that discussion paper. So we don't want to lose the focus and we don't want to lose momentum. So we're going to keep reinforcing what we've learned and also informing you of what's coming up and what the possible changes are. And with that, I'll finish.